Alan Dixon, who is president of the New Zealand University Students Association. Alan, good morning to you. Welcome to the show.
Morning, Michael. Thank you so much for having me.
No, listen, it's a pleasure. Can I just ask, first of all, the viewpoint of students at the moment to do with this? As I explained to you in the introduction, I've got daughters. I'm, obviously, so for a lot of other people, sons and daughters who are thinking about where to go. And at the moment, they're looking at the New Zealand tertiary sector and they're looking across the Tasman and saying, I'd actually rather go and do my degree in Australia because A, it'll be worth more, and B, it doesn't appear to be suffering these sorts of cuts. Are you getting that sort of feedback yourself from your members?
Absolutely. It's a very legitimate question for students at the moment, given the current context that they're in with the cost of living crisis, that impacting their ability to be able to study without working. We're clocking people working about 20 to 40 hours a week in addition to studying. A lot of them have decided, like your daughter, to go on a gap year because they want additional experiences that currently they don't feel that they can necessarily have in the tertiary environment, or are still deciding the trajectory of where they want their career to go. But yeah, with things opening up like Australia, which have been hailed as political successes, and from one lens they are also highly likely to steal a lot of our potential nurses and teachers, because they're offering packages that are just way more sustainable in this environment than what we can offer. So there is a genuine crisis in the tertiary sector, and students know that. What we see then is it creates a bit of an equity issue between those who can access those spaces and those who are in spaces where they are considering, is tertiary education even my future period? So there's a lot of questions among the student populace at the moment, which is difficult to understand.
And the other thing also is the unfairness of student allowances and versus student loans.
Indeed.
Indeed. I have to say, my children won't qualify for student allowances, but they are sitting there who with colleagues who will, as a consequence of their parents being self-employed or having money in trusts and things like that. I think roughly half, probably a little bit less, people qualify for student allowances, and they're sitting in a class with somebody who's getting no allowance at all. It's not a very equitable system, the way it's structured at the moment, is it?
It's not, and the stringent means testing on StudyLink with the student allowance is a complex environment to be in, because it draws the line in places where a lot of people are not able to articulate their personal circumstance when it comes to allowance. Although there's also been debates about when you're dealing with allowance, a lot of people may then have additional supplements that they may have access to from MSD that they don't even know about. So it's like a whole entire environment that a lot of people find very opaque and very confusing. And then also the element of taking on student debt in this current environment, which has been argued by a lot of political parties to be able to be achieved post your education, that you're able to pay that debt off, is not happening. We're seeing that people are paying off Afterpay and credit card debt faster than they're paying off in this country student loan debt, which is, we got a very sad message from a grandfather in this country who's 75, I think it is, or 72, and he recently messaged us saying, my children have gone over to Australia because they can't pay back their debt in their 40s. So I think what we're looking at is there's not sustainable planning for debt management, and I was really sad to see in the budget that there has been some information put towards debt education, but it hasn't been put towards actually helping those who would be considered on low incomes in these spaces actually have a sustainable tertiary environment for themselves, which is still argued to be the best way for the middle class student to be able to increase their likelihood of getting a decent career in the future. But we'd return then to those kinds of conversations. Why can't we model ourselves more off the Scandinavian system? Why can't we create an education system that is a bit more inclusive? I know there's been all sorts of different questions of why did postgraduate allowance not get reinstated, because it's such a minimal impact on the taxpayer. And then alternatively, we've got bigger ambitions among some of our membership in those spaces, and we've been pushing for a while for universal educational income, but that has to also be sustainable for the wider environment of the cost of living crisis. So it's a complex time, and definitely the decisions on allowances and access to loans in those spaces is really impacting students' ability to decide whether or not they will complete tertiary studies.
Ellen, the other thing is, and listen, I'm not going to beat about the bush, there are far too many people at university who really shouldn't be there. And it's almost for the last 20 years, and I mean, you're probably in your 20s, are you, Ellen?
A little bit older than that.
Okay.
I'm doing my doctorate, so
good on, no,
I've been
good
around it for a bit.
Okay, well, good on you. Good on you, because I know how difficult doctorates are, because I started one myself. Listen, the thing about, well, it's finishing them that's the problem. The thing about universities is that university used to be a place where you would go for specialists, and then there was vocational training and things like that. 20 years ago, so when you were, I guess, at primary school, there was a great desire that everybody goes to some form of tertiary education when they leave school. And now what we're seeing is an understanding that all that's done is settled. You've just given an example before. Plenty of people with lots of debts, which hasn't provided the economic means by which they can easily repay those, and many of them with degrees that they can't actually use in the workplace or are unable to do anyhow. Do we need some sort of rationalisation, some sort of review, some sort of overhaul of the tertiary sector in New Zealand in general?
I think the answer to we need an overhaul of the tertiary sector and actually looking towards sustainable plans is yes. I do think in terms of like those students going to universities, it's quite a complex subject because there's a multiplicity of things tying into this space at the moment. First and foremost, there is the massification of education, which happened during the period of sort of 1970s onward, which was pushing for more attendance and was attempting to reverse the sort of university as the elitist orientation which we see with Ivies these days overseas. So there is an argument for opening up those spaces because, you know, you're getting then sometimes students from low decile schools into universities who may not necessarily have considered that as an option for themselves, which in and of itself is an equity issue. I mean, when we look at the majority of students, they're coming from the high decile range, and we want more flexibility within that, because just because you're from a high decile school doesn't necessarily mean that therefore university is the best place for you, and doesn't mean from your low decile school that university isn't a space for you. Also, raising the status of vocational learning, because there's still, unfortunately in this country, the mentality that vocational learning is somehow lesser because of the evolution as to how it was within the high school system and then how it moved into the tertiary.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, you're right on that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
if you're trained for a trade, you're not considered to be socioeconomically or have the same status as somebody who's got some sort of degree or diploma. And you're right. That's wrong.
Yeah, sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's an essential part of infrastructure and should be treated as an essential part of infrastructure.
Yeah.
But also I think because of the way that it's formulated, which is what we now see with the structure of Te Pūkenga, unfortunately there's been a lot of lack of clarity within the trajectory of vocational learning in general in Aotearoa from the period of high schools onwards, and as a consequence there's been no clear set, like this is the way we want to go, unfortunately. So in addition to that, we're seeing an increase in private structures who think that they can take on apprentices without having tertiary education. So globally, we're seeing with massive open online courses, micro-credentials and digital badges, they're taking young people on not necessarily holding a qualification because they know they can train them in-house with the particular areas of expertise that they want in things like engineering and ICT degrees. Yeah, it's a really interesting changing time, particularly with moves to like open research and open data. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be addressing what that looks like in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
No,
and I mean, when we look at the...
I understand that, but I mean, we're long overdue for that systemic review of our tertiary sector. And you've highlighted some good points there. Large numbers of employers, but also entire industries are bypassing tertiary to go and get theirs and train their own personnel for the jobs that are out there now. Listen, the other thing I'd like to ask you, though, is, and I'm sort of interested in the politics of this. In discussion with Professor Roper yesterday, I was saying, you don't have anybody right into the horizon, don't you? For example, Labor offered, I think, free tuition fees for your first year at university. Ironically, I thought that sort of compounded the problem rather than improved it. So you get free tuition fees if you go and spend your first year at a tertiary institution. That's it. So there was nothing else in the budget that was going to play around with your sector at all. And there is nothing that I've seen from any of the political parties that suggests that might change. Brian Roper said he thought Labor might come up with a second year of free tuition fees, but he said that won't solve the chronic underfunding problem, particularly keeping staff and courses alive. So we were talking about well, nothing's happening this year, so 2023 is settled. There is no money in the budget to influence 2024. So the earliest that you could possibly get anything that will affect tertiary studies and students will be 2025, and that would require somebody to offer something that isn't currently there. How optimistic are you about that occurring?
Currently, I'm not very optimistic. I mean, what we did see with budget was the 5% increase in student achievement component funds. That is better than the provisions that the Labour government did in budget 2021 and 2022. So those respectively were an increase of 1.2% and 2.75% during the periods when inflation was at about 6.9%, so completely inappropriate for what we were actually dealing with. We're still not matching the rate of inflation within that space.
No.
And also we're seeing a drop in funding per student at an institutional level where the government is supporting approximately 80% of funding for these tertiary institutions in the university space at least. So to me, it doesn't look like there's a preference for it. I do know that the Minister of Education did try and fight for that 5% increase when going into Cabinet and debating how they were going to fund it. And I know with the context of the cyclone post-pandemic build, it's been difficult to put the priority on that. But I think the reality is there's already a crisis here, which is what we can see from these deficits. And if you don't act proactively in this space, because this is not just a deficit that's happened due to one factor, it's happened due to a number of global factors, in addition to, big technological changes, pandemic context, lowered enrollments, cost of living crisis. Students will not be able to sustain themselves throughout that period.
No, they won't.
If there is not something done significant. And I must admit, I am getting quite frustrated that a lot of the political parties are not taking it seriously in the context. It's just been used as a sort of bait for the general election, but no one's actually released any policies of significance other than a little different with the Greens recently. So it seems like it's not a priority, and given the fact that the entire education sector, from everywhere from early childhood education up to tertiary and adult education at some point have striked over the last 2 years, that tells us exactly where the education sector is at in this context. And it's not healthy. No,
it's a fair point. Yes, it's the entire sector. It's not just tertiary. You're absolutely right. Listen, finally though, can I ask, the rankings, the international rankings, now, whether you like them or not, it's sort of moot because universities take them bloody seriously in this country, both as a point of difference between themselves, but also in trying to attract, in particular, international students. Professor Roper made the point yesterday that the international students are critical to the funding model that universities have currently, rightly or wrongly. And if you can't attract them, you're in serious bother. There are the last rankings that have just come out, and there are, I think, three or four major international tertiary ranking organisations. But I noticed that there are 8 universities from Australia in the top 100, and there isn't one from New Zealand. And I'm wondering, how did they get it so right that they've got 8 and we've got none?
Indeed, it's a very good question. I mean, I cannot speak on the behalf of my Australian colleagues in the context that they've been working with, although they've been following our situation with the cuts quite closely because they're having a similar mirroring effect amongst their staff with deficits at the moment. But I think, a lot of this comes down to actually targeting it effectively within education as to what sustainable funding models might look like, and also working out who your student populace is and how to support them within that space. Also, we have a weird mixture of public and private within Aotearoa, New Zealand, when it comes to tertiary education. Te Pukenga is currently under Crown structure, and then our universities are independent, and yet most of their funding comes from government. I think what we end up with is a bit of an identity crisis, and then in the traction of what we're supposed to be. So we look to international spaces for direction, and I actually had to pull up the TEC recently on something where they were using comparisons of the likes of Ivy Leagues and private institutions to compare to our system. Why can't we be like that? Well, currently we have a confusion in the trajectory of where tertiary education is at, and that's not set by these institutions as much as the government has tried to make it look like that is the case. This is actually what's being set in policy at the very top. It doesn't mean that we can't have leading innovation and research in their spaces, but it also, when we think about university spaces, the funding that they receive, which is I think approximately about 1.2% of our GDP, which is low when you look at the OECD in terms of what's given to research, is also fought for by Crown institutes as well. So funding within the tertiary sector as a whole is a very complicated subject and probably has not been investigated since that period of the reforms that happened from the 1970s through to about the early 1990s. There's an underlying conversation that hasn't happened.
Well, and so you and I find common cause on the need to do a radical overview of this, because we know the current system's not working. Hey, listen, thanks very much for joining us, Alan. It's been a pleasure. And we'll keep in touch. If there's anything that you feel you need to raise to our listeners, more than happy to, provide you with that opportunity.
Thank you very much. I've appreciated this opportunity, Michael, and just really hope that there can be a conversation for these universities about their debt and sustainable funding models from the government coming forward.
Good on you. Thanks very much. Okay, that's Ellen Dixon, who is the President of New Zealand University Students Association. Now,